He smiled at the audience, that lazy, half-awake grin that made people feel like they were in on the joke. "Anybody got a light?" he asked casually, cigarette hanging from his lips. It was a throwaway moment. He'd done it 100 times before. Someone would flick a lighter, the crowd would laugh, Dean would thank them, and the show would roll on. That's when Salvatore Beges Rinaldi moved, slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew every eye in the room would follow him. Beges leaned back in his chair, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a gun. Not a small one, a heavy, blued steel revolver that caught the stage lights and reflected them back in cold flashes. The chatter in the room died instantly. Glasses froze halfway to mouths. Dealers stopped moving. Even the waitresses stopped breathing. Beges held the gun up, arm extended, and smiled. "Here you go, Deno," he said. "Uzi dis." For a split second, time fractured. 20 seconds stretched into eternity. Dean Martin saw everything at once. The gun, the grin, the message. This wasn't a joke. This was dominance. Beges wasn't offering a light. He was reminding everyone in that room who decided whether you walked out alive. If Dean panicked, if he recoiled, if he treated the gun like what it really was, the moment would own him forever. He'd be the singer who flinched, the entertainer who showed fear, and in Vegas, fear was fatal. The band stopped playing. The spotlight burned hot on Dean's face. 500 people stared, waiting to see whether the king of cool would crack. Dean didn't step back. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, squinted at the gun like it was mildly inconvenient, and said, "That's very nice, sir, but I was thinking something with a little less kick." The room gasped. Dean reached out, not fast, not slow, just smooth. He gently pushed the barrel of the gun downward with 2 fingers, like he was correcting the angle of a microphone. Then he looked big, straight in the eye, and added, "Besides, if that thing goes off, you're gonna ruin my tie. And Frank already told me this one makes me look thin for half a heartbeat." No one knew if that was the bravest line ever spoken on a Vegas stage or the last words of Dean Martin's life. Then Beges started laughing. Not polite laughter, not fake laughter. Real, barking, uncontrollable laughter that shook his shoulders and echoed through the Copa room. He pulled the gun back, slapped it on the table, and waved to one of his men, who immediately produced a lighter and flicked it open. Big S stood up, lighter raised, and called out, "Come on, Deno. I ain't trying to kill you. I just wanted to see if you still had it." Dean leaned down, lit his cigarette, took a slow drag, and exhaled toward the ceiling. "Sal," he said, "if you wanted to see if I still had it, you could be just asked. We're friends." Friends? The word landed like a miracle. The crowd erupted not in cheers at first, but in nervous laughter, then applause, then a roar that shook the walls. The band picked back up as if nothing had happened. Dean turned his back on the table, walked back to center stage, and launched straight into the next song like he hadn't just stared down a loaded gun. Beges stayed for the rest of the show. He applauded louder than anyone. When Dean finished his final number and gave his bow, Beges stood and tipped his glass toward the stage in a silent toast. Backstage, Dean's hands were shaking so badly he had to sit down. A stagehand tried to offer him a drink. Dean waved it away. "If I start shaking on the outside," he said quietly, "I won't stop." Word of the incident traveled through Vegas before dawn. By morning, everyone knew the story. The mob knew. The entertainers knew. The casino owners knew. Dean Martin had been offered a gun on stage and treated it like a punchline. From that night on, something changed. Dean wasn't just tolerated by the men who ran Vegas. He was respected, not because he was reckless, but because he understood the rules and refused to be owned by them. Years later, when someone asked him if he'd been scared that night, Dean shrugged and said, "Of course I was. Only a fool wouldn't be, but fierce like a spotlight. If you let it hit your face, the whole room sees it." On October 14th, 1960, under the lights of the Copa Room, Dean Martin didn't let fear steal the show. He took a moment that should have destroyed him and turned it into legend. Not by force, not by threats, but by doing the one thing nobody expected. How he stayed cool and in Las Vegas that made him untouchable. Dean looked out at the audience with that familiar half-smile, the one that always made it feel like he was letting you in on a private joke, and shrugged. Anybody got a light. It was supposed to be nothing, a throwaway beat, a little crowd work to keep the room warm. Someone in the front row would usually flick a lighter. Dean would lean down, crack a joke, light a cigarette, and the night would roll on. He'd done it hundreds of times. Nothing special, nothing dangerous, but this Jimmy. The room changed. Front and center sat Big S. Rinaldi, perfectly still in his tailored suit, his face unreadable, his eyes flat and lifeless. Instead of reaching for a lighter, he slowly slipped his hand inside his jacket. The movement alone was enough to suck the air out of the Copa Room. People stopped breathing. Glasses froze mid-air. Then he brought his hand back out and placed a gun on the table. Not casually, deliberately. Heavy, real, loaded. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd, but no one made a sound. Big S picked up the gun, held it up toward the stage, and smiled. "Here you go, Dino," he said calmly. "Uzi this." Time stretched. 400 people watched in silence as Dean Martin stood under the spotlight, cigarette between his fingers, staring at a gun being offered to him as a joke that wasn't a joke. Everyone in that room understood what this was. A test. A reminder. A man showing power in the only way men like him knew how. Panic would humiliate Dean. Anger would get him killed. Backing away would mark him forever. Dean didn't move. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, reached down, and took the gun from Big S's hand. Just like that. No hesitation, no hush. He felt the weight of it, turned it over in his palm, inspecting it like he was browsing merchandise. The chrome caught the stage lights, scattering reflections across the ceiling. You could hear the room's collective heartbeat. Dean smiled. That easy, unbothered Dean Martin smile. "Thanks, boss," he said smoothly, his voice carrying perfectly through the silence. "But this model burns too loud. It'll drown out my voice." A second passed, then another dot, and then Big S laughed. Not polite laughter. Hey-ow laughter. Loud, booming, unstoppable. He slapped the table, shook his head, and waved one of his men forward. The man immediately produced a lighter, flicked it on, and held it up toward the stage. Dean leaned down, lit his cigarette, took a slow drag, and exhaled like nothing had happened. The room erupted. Nervous laughter, turned into applause, then into cheers. The band picked up instantly. Dean turned back toward the microphone and went right into the next line of his act, cool as ice, as if he hadn't just stared down a loaded gun. Big Ass stayed for the rest of the show. He applauded louder than anyone. When Dean took his final bow, Big S stood, raised his glass, and nodded. Backstage, Dean sat down hard. His hands were shaking now that no one could see. Someone offered him a drink. He waved it away. "If I let it show out there," he said quietly, "it would have never stopped." By morning, everyone in Vegas knew what happened. Not from the papers. From whispers. From dealers, waiters, musicians, and men who knew exactly how close Dean Martin had come to crossing a line you don't cross. From that night on, Dean wasn't just tolerated in Vegas. He was respected because in a room owned by fear, Dean Martin didn't flinch, didn't posture, didn't beg. He disarmed power with calm, with humor, with absolute control of himself. Years later, when someone asked him if he'd been scared that night, Dean shrugged. "Of course I was," he said. "Only a fool wouldn't be. But fears, like a spotlight, let it hit your face, and everyone sees it." On that night in the Copa room, Dean Martin didn't let fear steal the show. He turned a moment meant to break him into legend, not with force, not with threats, but by staying exactly who he was. Cool, unshakable, untouchable. "You made me laugh," Big S continued, shaking his head slowly, "and that doesn't happen often." Dean leaned back slightly in the chair, relaxed but alert, like a man sitting near fire who knows exactly how close he can get without getting burned. "That's my job," Dean said calmly. "If I can't make people laugh, I shouldn't be up there." Big S studied him for a long moment, then took a sip of his whiskey. "That wasn't your job out there," he said. "That was you deciding who you are." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know what you did tonight, right?" Dean met his eyes without flinching. "I kept the show moving." Big S chuckled. "No. You showed me something. You didn't bow. You didn't challenge. You didn't beg. You treated me like a man. Not a monster, not a god. Equal." He paused. "That takes guts. Or stupidity." "Usually both," Dean said, echoing a line he'd used more than once in his life. Big S laughed again, louder this time. "That's why I like you, Dino. You're not pretending. Most people in this town are playing a role. Tough guy, Biggie Shotch. Scared little mouse pretending he's a lion. You," he pointed at Dean, "you're exactly who you look like." The room went quiet for a beat. Then Big S reached into his jacket again. Dean didn't move. He didn't tense. He just watched. Big S pulled out not the gun, but a thick roll of cash and placed it on the table between them. "For the disrespect," Big S said. Dean glanced at the money, then back at Big S. He shook his head once. "Wasn't disrespect." Big S raised an eyebrow. "It was a show," Dean said. "And I finished it. That's all." Big S stared at him for a long second, then slowly pulled the cash back and tucked it away. "Good answer." He stood and extended his hand. "We're good, Dino. You ever need anything in this town, you come see me." Dean stood and shook his hand. Firm, brief, no lingering. "Appreciate it." Appreciate it. As Dean walked back down the hallway toward his dressing room, his legs finally felt heavy. The adrenaline drained out of him all at once, leaving a hollow ache behind his ribs. He closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since he stepped on. His hands were shaking now, badly. He poured himself a drink, took one sip, then set it down untouched. Later that night, Frank Sinatra called. "What the hell did you do tonight?" Frank demanded. Dean smiled to himself. "Finished my show." "You had a gun pointed at you," Frank said. "Yeah," Dean replied. "Bad lighter." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, low and amazed. "You're out of your mind." "Probably," Dean said. "But you handled it," Frank added. "You really handled it." The story spread through Vegas the way real stories always do. Quietly, through waiters and dealers, pit bosses and musicians, men who didn't write things down but never forgot them. Dean Martin didn't get bothered after that, not because people were afraid of him, but because they respected him. He knew the rules. He knew the danger, and he didn't pretend otherwise. Years later, someone asked Dean if that was the scariest moment of his life. He thought about it for a second, then shook his head. "No," he said. "The scariest moments are the ones where you don't know who you are yet." That night at the Sands, with a gun on a white tablecloth and 400 people holding their breath, Dean Martin knew exactly who he was, and so did everyone else. "You made me look good, and you looked good. That takes talent." Big S took a slow sip of his whiskey, never breaking eye contact. "That thing you said about the gun being too loud, that was smart. You weren't calling me stupid. You weren't preaching. You were just saying it wasn't your style." "I respect that," Dean nodded once, calm but honest. "I meant no disrespect. I know who you are. I know what you can do. But I also know who I am. And I can't be me if I'm scared on my own stage." Big S smiled, not cold this time, but amused, impressed. "That's exactly it. You've got respect without being a pushover. You got dignity without being reckless." He leaned forward. "I've been coming to your shows for 3 years. I've watched you deal with drunks, hecklers, loudmouths of every kind. You always keep your cool, always stay classy. Tonight, I wanted to see if that was real or just an act. Turns out it's real." He stood and extended his hand. "From now on, you've got my protection. Anyone gives you trouble in this town, they answer to me. You're a stand-up guy. I know. There aren't many left." Dean shook his hand. Firm. Equal. No fear. No submission, just one thing. Big S added as Dean turned to leave. "That line about the gun being too loud is already going around town. People are laughing, saying you burned me. I could take that the wrong way." Dean stopped, his hand on the doorknob. This was the real test. Or, Big S continued, "I could take it the right way. As respect. Your choice. How should I take it?" Dean turned back. "I think you should take it the way you want people to remember you, as a man with power who doesn't need to prove it every 5 minutes. A man confident enough to laugh at a good joke, even when it's on him. That's real power." Big S stared at him, then nodded once. "Get out of here before I change my mind about liking you." Dean left. His hands didn't start shaking until he locked the dressing room door behind him. He'd just gambled his life on reading another man correctly, and he'd won but only barely dot. By morning, the story was everywhere, not in newspapers, in whispers, in casinos, lounges, dressing rooms. Dean Martin had been offered a gun as a lighter and turned it into a joke so clean, so fearless, that he walked away with respect instead of blood on the floor. Frank Sinatra called him days later, half laughing, half stunned. "You're out of your mind, and it's the coolest damn thing I've ever heard. You're buying the drinks next time." Years later, when asked if it really happened, Dean just smiled. A gentleman doesn't tell stories about other gentlemen. Draw your own conclusions. And when asked if he'd have unscared, he paused before answering. There are two kinds of power in this world. One comes from fear, from guns, from making people obey because they're afraid. That power only lasts as long as the fear does. The other kind comes from knowing who you are and refusing to be less than that. That kind of power can't be taken from you. Not with a gun. Not with anything. "So, were you scared?" Dean smiled again. "Of course I was. Being scared and being yourself aren't opposites. That night, I was both thought. The gun never fired, but it did something more lasting. It proved that Dean Martin's cool wasn't an act. When the moment came, when everything was on the line, he didn't reach for bravado or violence. He reached for himself. And in a city built on masks and menace, that was the bravest move of all.